I think the overarching point that I'd like to make, and I can be brief because many of the points I wanted to raise have already been raised, is that objections, barriers, what's standing between those of us who support this measure and its legislation are not economics. There really are not a set of compelling, dispositive, strong, empirical economic arguments against an FTT of the magnitude that we're discussing. I'll emphasize some of the details of that, but the key point is that those arguments do not exist. I'm not saying that people won't make them. I'm not saying that people won't make arguments that are that say, let's not do that, let's do something else instead, and I'll get into that. But the key barrier is a political one, not an economic one. And one of the key political barriers, this has been my experience, and I very much take David's point about the avoidance argument having a lot less meat to it than it sounds like. But I will tell you, from my experience in fairly high corridors of power, that the idea that we can't do it until Europe does it is a very strong one. And Sarah as well mentioned the importance of that type of argument as undercutting our case. So the progress that David reported is extremely important. I'm not saying that once the EU jumps, we'll jump the next day. But by taking that rug out from under the opposition, whether it's substantive or not, stipulating David's points on avoidance, that's a very, very big deal, as I see it, in terms of political barriers. I just wanted to go back now, just for a second, to square one, because I do think that many of us may be called upon, or perhaps there are objective folks in the audience who just are puzzling this through, to think about, well, why would you want to do something like this in the first place? I think I'm still enough of an economist to not just think, a tax, good, let's do it. I think there needs to be generally a rationale. I mean, obviously, and I actually feel quite strongly about this, and frankly, it's not that obvious to many of the members who work in this building, we need revenues. So our public goods could really very much benefit, not to mention our longer-term budget sustainability and future deficits could benefit from the $350 billion 10-year score of the 3 basis point FTT that Fazio has introduced. So obviously there's a revenue case, but that's not enough. I think this. I think that what I think of when I think of kind of a tax rationale is that you generally want to raise revenues in basic public finance 101 ways, in ways that are neutral vis-a-vis behavior. You'd rather not incentivize or discourage one or another type of behavior. And in this case, you might say, aha, an FTT fails that test because clearly it disincentivizes frequent trades. Well, there's a whole nother bin of taxation that's just as important as this neutrality clause. That is, you ideally want taxes to be relatively neutral vis-a-vis behavior. Not always. There's something called Pagovian taxes, named after economist named Pagov. And Pagovian taxes are like a cigarette tax. It's widely agreed upon that that's something that society has good reason to discourage because of the negative externalities associated with it. If you smoke cigarettes, it's not just a problem for you, but it's a problem for me as someone who has to pay a public share of the health costs as well as secondary smoke, whatever. Well, it's a very short skip and a jump over to negative externalities from the distortions caused by high-speed trading. This is a relatively new argument because when I started thinking and talking about an FTT, HFT, high-frequency trading, wasn't as big a deal. So the Pagovian nature of the tax is increasingly important, and my analysis suggests that an FTT of even less than 3 basis points would make the majority of high-frequency trades unprofitable. That's how tiny and narrow their margins are. The other argument, in a Pagovian sense, for an FTT is that there's it's related to HFT, but it's not the only case. It incentivizes more patient capital. And that's something that also I think many of us who've looked at financial markets in recent years think is important. That the productivity of the US economy is not helped and in fact is hurt when capital markets fail to do what it was that I was taught they do when I was in grad school 150 years ago, which was the efficient and most productive allocation of excess savings. That's what you learn about when they teach you about what financial markets do. They distribute excess savings to their most productive sector, and they do it most efficiently. But that's not what we've seen. For those of us who follow this, there's been impatient capital, there's been financial market innovations that undercut that. In fact, there's some recent interesting stories being told based on some work by a guy from Harvard on just the extent of how much just share buybacks are playing a role in market valuations these days. So, again, strong rationale, I think, for a Pigovian tax. I guess the only other comments I would make, I had some sort of technical comments about how you might best implement this, but David covered some of them. I'll say one thing about that, but first, let me touch on one other thing. Another part of this debate, for those of us who are ensconced in the US discussion, David, I'm not sure how much you've been falling prey to this, is you hear people who don't like an FTT offering an alternative. They clearly got together and said, don't just oppose an FTT. People are really pissed off at financial markets. Throw them something else. And I've heard three ideas, and I don't mean to be so cynical, because I think there are people who actually believe in these ideas. But I think it's important to recognize that there are at least three different ideas out there that are floating around as substitutes for an FTT. One is a FAT, an FAT, which is a financial activities tax. This is based off the value-added tax, something economists like very much. A value-added tax is simply the tax that you pay on the difference between sales and the cost of your inputs. So it's the value added to whatever it is that you're producing. Well, financial firms do the same thing. They borrow and they lend, and the difference between their costs and their profits could be taxed under a financial activities tax, and it's typically articulated over some threshold, so you just sort of go after the large folks at the top. That's one alternative. Now, there are some tax folks who prefer a FAT to an FTT because they say it's not so narrowly targeted, it's much broader, it goes after the whole sector, it doesn't just go after these one small group of people who are doing a lot of trading. And I think they have a point, but at the same time, as I mentioned, there's a lot of Pigovian factors that the FTT targets that the FAT doesn't. The White House, by the way, does not have an FTT in their budget for reasons that but as was discussed earlier, the Treasury isn't there. But there is something they have called a crisis responsibility fee, which is basically, if you look at it, it's basically a tax on leverage among the biggest financial institutions. These folks are my friends, my colleagues, I've worked with them, I was there when that went into the budget. And so I'm not telling tales out of school. I would say this to the faces of the friends who I've worked with, is that no one says a thing about that ever. I mean, I suspect no one in this room has ever, maybe some people on the dais, has ever heard of the crisis responsibility fee, this tax on it. So it's in the budget, but it may as well not be, because nobody's pushing for it at all. And then finally, and I thought this was actually very interesting, Dave Camp, Republican, head tax writer on the Republican House side, actually had an excise tax on systemically important institutions, defined, I believe, as Dodd-Frank did, of 35 basis points. And of course, many of his Republican friends didn't like that and dropped, in fact, his whole tax plan was dead about 5 minutes after he introduced it. But I thought it was very interesting that he had that plan in there. And there are those of us in this debate who are flexible enough to see the virtues and perhaps even endorse other versions of this. But I do think that by dint of its Bogovian advantages, the FTT has certain advantages over others. But if somebody came forward and said, tomorrow you can have a FAT, I think many of us would probably jump on that. Just in closing, I think there's always a good question to ask when you're in these tax debates, which is, what would happen? What would happen if you actually did this? Well, if you listen to the debate, you would think no one's ever done this before and it's just the tax idea from outer space. The materials you have outside, what you heard David articulate, the stamp tax in the city, and not to mention the existing tiny versions of FTTs on U.S. securities, as mentioned earlier, exist. And there's no coherent or cogent economic argument that would lead you to believe that an FTT of a few basis points would have anything like the kinds of catastrophic effects that opponents raise. But of course, it's very typical in the U.S. tax debate to hear exactly that when anybody says anything like that. I think based on the comments Sarah made, and some of the progress David's making, we are very much playing to our strengths to ignore that and bring the facts of the case to the case. Thanks very much.